Garrett chose Tuesday breakfast for the announcement. Standing at the marble island, with his membership folio open beside the fruit bowl, then looking at me like I was already gone. He said Simone was moving into the townhouse that night and I should leave before I made things embarrassing. As if humiliation were a courtesy he was offering. I kept stirring my coffee until the spoon stopped tapping the mug. Then asked whether Simone still drank Brut Rosé, or if she had upgraded her taste, now that she was inheriting my address. He blinked once. Hard. Like I had stepped over a line, only he was allowed to draw. And I watched his hand flatten against the leather folio. 2 days earlier, I had already seen the draft occupancy agreement tucked inside it. His name listed where it had no authority to be. Bold and stupid. He had expected tears. Maybe shouting. Maybe one last pleading speech to confirm his importance. But I had already read the scene before he walked into it. The townhouse was quiet in that expensive Gold Coast way that makes betrayal sound even cheaper. The espresso machine humming while my husband tried to evict me from property he did not control. I set my cup down. Took in the exact details that mattered. His overnight bag by the stairs. Simone's garment bag near the entry bench. And the extra set of keys missing from the tray. Then I slid my own keys onto the counter and told him not to forget the building assessments. Because the first of the month was coming fast, and romance never seemed to cover overhead. That was the moment his confidence slipped. Not when I left, but when he realized I was leaving too cleanly. Without one broken plate or one wasted threat, he followed me into the foyer asking why I was acting like this. And I picked up my coat. My laptop case, and the weekender I had packed on Sunday. When I stepped outside into the cold and heard the lock click behind me, I did not feel thrown away. I felt the way a person feels when a door closes on the wrong side of her plan. By the time Garrett locked that door behind me, I had already spent 4 months watching him replace me in increments small enough to pass for ordinary neglect. It began with receipts left in jacket pockets. Private dining charges buried under member development, and hotel confirmations landing on mornings he claimed he had slept at work. Then Cora came into my office with a donor dinner seating chart and asked why Simone Cade had been listed beside Garrett under a guest category we had never used. After that, I stopped listening for lies because the paperwork was cleaner than his voice ever was. Nolan pulled Garrett's reimbursement logs, matched them against my household calendar, and found 12 clean overlaps between his client nights and Simone's posts from the same rooms. When I enlarged one of her stories and caught Garrett's watch reflected in a brass elevator panel behind her shoulder, I did not feel disbelief anymore. Only order. What made it uglier was not the affair but the architecture of it. Because they were not stealing moments. They were rehearsing a transfer. Simone was not some dazzled outsider who wandered into a married man's orbit. She was positioning herself inside my life. One room, one table, one contact at a time. Cora forwarded me an email Simone had sent to a founder after one of our museum dinners, describing herself as stepping into a Gold Coast residence with philanthropic access. IT, and that sentence told me everything. The townhouse was never just a marriage asset, which is why Garrett's breakfast performance sounded so confident and landed so stupidly. Years earlier, when I expanded the studio and our accountant pushed asset separation, the property went under North Harbor House LLC, with me as managing member because my capital carried the purchase. Garrett signed what was put in front of him, lost interest halfway through the operating agreement, and spent the next several years mistaking boredom for authority. So when I saw that draft occupancy agreement inside his folio, his name typed above authority he did not possess, I understood the replacement had already been planned. He was not improvising cruelty in a bad marriage. He was trying to install Simone into a structure he never bothered to learn, counting on my silence like a fixed utility. By the time I walked out that morning with my weekender and laptop case, I was not leaving in shock. I was making room for the paperwork to do its job. Simone was never the kind of woman who wandered into another woman's life by accident and then stood there blinking like she had taken a wrong elevator. By the time Garrett clicked that lock behind me, she had already used my rooms, my schedule, and my social orbit with the calm precision of someone measuring curtains before purchase. I knew that because 3 of her recent posts had been taken inside my house. Not close to it, not near it, but inside it, framed against surfaces I had chosen myself. One story caught the edge of my lacquered console in the entry hall. Another reflected my dining room sconces in a wineglass. And the third showed my staircase landing behind her bare shoulder. She had captioned them lightly, all soft launch nonsense and private season language. But there is nothing vague about a woman using another woman's home as background. Cora sent each screenshot without commentary, then followed with one short text. She knows exactly where she is. And I did not disagree. What made Simone dangerous was not youth or beauty or nerve, but intention sharpened by research and dressed as ease. She had not just taken Garrett to bed. She had studied the architecture around him, the guest lists, the museum dinners, the donor names, the kind of address that changes how strangers listen. When Cora forwarded Simone's email to a founder, describing herself as stepping into a Gold Coast residence with philanthropic access, I read it twice and felt every word land exactly where it aimed. That sentence told me she did not want a man in transition. She wanted the finished room, the polished silver, the dinner seat with my name scraped off. She wanted the social shorthand that came with that townhouse, the assumption of belonging, the illusion that if she stood there long enough, the walls would start telling my story in her voice. Garrett may have been reckless enough to think he was simply upgrading his life, but Simone was disciplined enough to know she was joining a transfer. So I did not waste time imagining that she would grow a conscience once the romance turned administrative and the paperwork started showing its teeth. I gave Jocelyn everything. The posts, the email, the timeline, the occupancy draft Garrett had tucked into his folio like authority could be printed into existence. By the time Simone crossed my threshold with her garment bags and curated calm, I was already stripping the house of everything that was mine and putting her name where it belonged. On the record. Next to intent. I did not do anything cheap after that. Because cheap is messy, emotional, and usually illegal. And I was not about to hand Garrett a victim story. Jocelyn moved first, sending formal notice that Simone was occupying property without valid authorization and that any claim Garrett made as owner was unsupported by the operating documents. A second letter followed before noon, demanding preservation of records, warning against commercial use of the townhouse image, and making it clear that every conversation now belonged in writing. Garrett called within an hour, already halfway between outrage and confusion, asking if I was seriously trying to turn a private marriage problem into some kind of legal stunt. I told him this had stopped being private the moment he drafted housing papers on an asset he did not control and moved another woman inside it. He exhaled hard enough for me to hear his panic under the anger, then tried the softer line. Delaney, don't do this. And I let the silence answer him. Nolan finished the financial schedule that same afternoon, lining Garrett's expense reimbursements against dinners, suites, cars, and gift charges that had nothing to do with legitimate member cultivation. The pattern was clean enough to survive daylight, which was all I needed. Because once numbers stop sounding emotional, men like Garrett lose the shelter of calling everything an overreaction. By evening, Jocelyn had folded those records into the larger strategy. Not as scandal, not as revenge theater, but as evidence that marital funds had been diverted into an affair with measurable precision. What I wanted was not to drag them out by force or play games with locks, utilities, or hysterics, because that would have lowered me into the kind of chaos they deserved. What I wanted was more expensive than humiliation, which was for them to sit still long enough to understand the actual market rate of the life they had tried to steal. Cora did the only social move that mattered, quietly notifying the right vendors and contacts that all property and household correspondence must go through counsel. And in our world, that translated faster than shouting ever could. By the next morning, Garrett understood the shift, even if he could not yet name it. Because the house no longer felt like a romantic prize. It felt supervised. Simone felt it too. And I knew because her stories vanished. Her captions disappeared. And the soft launch tone gave way to total silence before lunch. I was not pushing them into the street like some bitter wife with wounded pride. I was doing something much colder and more permanent. I was converting fantasy into cost. Jocelyn gave them two options the next morning. And the beauty of both was that neither one let them keep pretending love had anything to do with what came next. They could vacate the townhouse and face formal proceedings built on unauthorized occupancy, false authority, and Garrett's paper trail. Or they could stay exactly where they wanted. If they chose to stay, they would do it under a real lease with North Harbor House LLC. At market rate, with every fantasy translated into numbers. Garrett called before noon, voice clipped and breathless, and asked whether I was actually trying to charge him rent to live in his own house. I told him the phrase, his own house had expired, the moment Jocelyn attached the operating agreement, and his silence lasted just long enough to sound expensive. Then Simone got on the line, trying for composure and missing it, asking what market rate meant. And I answered $8,500 a month, plus utilities, insurance, and a 2-month security deposit. The number hit exactly the way I wanted it to. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just heavy enough to make the room around them change temperature. That townhouse had parking, a rooftop deck, custom millwork, private security, and a Gold Coast address they had been wearing like borrowed jewelry, so I priced it accordingly. Garrett muttered that the old mortgage had been lower, and I told him mortgages reward ownership while rent measures desire, and desire was suddenly costing him more. Jocelyn sent the lease that afternoon. 12 months fixed. No subletting. No commercial use of the property image. No entertaining for brand promotion. No missed payment without consequences. If they defaulted, cure periods applied, then fees. Then the next legal step. And every page was cleaner than the little occupancy draft Garrett had tucked into his folio. Simone read far enough to find the personal guarantee and asked if her name really had to be there. And I told her innocence had left the building before she did. What made the trap work was not cruelty but structure. Because I was not asking them for anything dishonest, only the real cost of what they had already tried to occupy for free. Garrett had assumed that if he pushed me out, the house would keep running on invisible labor, invisible payments, invisible management, the way marriages often do when one person confuses maintenance with magic. Now every hidden service had a line item, every polished surface had upkeep behind it, and every month they stayed would force them to finance the life they thought they had stolen whole. They signed at Jocelyn's office 2 days later, and Garrett looked less betrayed than cornered, which suited me better because betrayal still leaves room for self-pity. Simone kept staring at the deposit total like it might blink first, but signatures have a way of ending performance, and hers landed right beside his. I did not throw them out of my house. I let them keep it long enough to understand that when fantasy loses subsidy and romance loses my name, all that remains is rent. The lease did what the affair never could, which was force Garrett and Simone to live inside the exact math they had dodged while borrowing my labor, my address, and my structure. Once their signatures dried, the townhouse stopped feeling like a romantic prize and started acting like what it had always been. A high-cost property with fixed obligations. They had wanted the polished life without the machinery under it, and machinery is harsher than heartbreak because it does not soften, improvise, or miss deadlines. Within 3 weeks, Garrett's voice on the phone had gone thin around the edges. The sound of a man realizing each morning was already charging him something before breakfast. He still showed up at the club in pressed jackets and polished shoes. But Nolan's audit packet had already reduced his charming ambiguity to reimbursement codes, reservation logs, and charges aligned against dates. Once those numbers sat in order on Jocelyn's desk, Garrett lost the one protection men like him trust most, which is calling a pattern a misunderstanding until someone prints it. The real pressure was never just the rent, but the insult of learning that rent was only the first invoice in a life they had mistaken for atmosphere. Utilities came in at full city rates. The insurance rider cost more than Simone expected. Cleaning bills arrived on schedule, and the deposit had already taken a visible bite out of them. Garrett had spent months living as if my life arranged itself around him, and now every finished surface in that townhouse required cash before it offered comfort. Simone held her public face for longer than I expected, and her private composure for less, which made sense once the image stopped paying her and started billing her back. Her stories never returned. Her client tags thinned, and Cora forwarded one quiet screenshot from a founder who replaced Simone on a launch dinner after deciding her brand felt unstable. No one needed spectacle because in our world, instability moves faster than gossip and leaves a cleaner bruise, which meant Simone's fall looked less like drama and more like exclusion. The first late notice went out on a Monday through property management. Clean, neutral, and indifferent. The way real consequences arrive when they no longer need anger to carry them. Garrett called that night asking if I would really do this over a few days, and I reminded him that a few days was all he had given me between marriage and replacement. By the time Jocelyn filed the divorce papers, the affair had already collapsed into overhead. And what finally killed them was not the house itself, but the fact that they had to fund their stolen life without my money, my management, or my name keeping it standing. By the time the divorce filings moved forward, Garrett had lost the part of the story he valued most, which was control over how other people described him in private rooms. He was no longer the polished man with a complicated marriage and perfect timing, just a tenant under pressure whose charm had failed under documentation, deadlines, and signed paper. Simone lasted beside him longer on paper than she did in spirit, but by then her silence had replaced her confidence, and silence looks very different when it is paying rent. Jocelyn closed every opening cleanly. Nolan protected every dollar that should have been protected. And Cora helped me move the last of my life into rooms that felt earned again. The townhouse stayed in my portfolio, not because I needed a monument to what happened there, but because I understood its value better than either of them ever had. Garrett had tried to turn that address into proof that I could be replaced. And instead, it became proof that what he thought was atmosphere had always been structure with my name under it. Healing, for me, was never going to look like a speech or some dramatic last confrontation in a parking lot, because I had already said everything that mattered in contracts. It looked like mornings without dread, a calendar filled with clients who respected my time, and a home that stayed quiet because no one inside it was trying to erase me. It looked like opening the studio door before 9, hearing my own heels on the floor, and realizing peace had a sharper edge than revenge ever did. I did not get my marriage back, and that turned out to be the cleanest win in the entire story. Because what left my life was not love, but a man who confused access with ownership. Garrett and Simone got exactly what they chose. A life they had to finance themselves, without my labor, my money, or my name lifting it above what it really was. And if you stayed with me through all of this, thank you. Because some endings do not arrive loud. They arrive steady. And I hope this one leaves you believing that peace, dignity, and a gentler kind of love are still worth finding.